All right. So, hey everyone, welcome. My name is Katie Marshall. I'm the director here at McCrosty Arts Center, and just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you would like subtitles or captions, you should be able to get a live transcript by clicking the CC button down at the bottom. We are recording the meeting this evening, and we'll hopefully be able to post that up on our website later on after the event. If you have questions as we're going along, you can type those into the chat, and we will have time for questions at the end. And let's see, that's all the housekeeping that is occurring to me right now, but I will, if anything else comes up, I'll let you know. It's been a little while since I've run a Zoom meeting, so I'm a little rusty, but thanks for your patience. So yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm really excited that we are able to have journalist and photographer Georgia Fort here. And we have, for those of you who haven't had a chance to come into McCrosty Art Center and see it, we have her exhibit, Freedom of the Press, up in our new Creative Space Gallery right next to McCrosty. And that will be on display through February 16th, or yes, 16th. So you've got one more week to come in and see it. You can also follow Georgia and all her work through her website and social media, which we'll share at the end of this too. So I am going to fortunately get to stand back and just run the logistics of things. And I'm really excited to be able to hand over the facilitating of this artist talk to Heidi Holton, who is one of the board members at KAXC and board member at McCrosty Art Center and is news director at KAXC Northern Community Radio. And she will be sort of facilitating the conversation with Georgia this evening. So thanks again to everyone for being here. And yeah, Heidi, you can take it away and I will mute myself.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks, Georgia, first of all, for being here. We're very excited. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, a little echoey. It's a new gallery. I'll try to move closer. New gallery here, so it's a little bit echoey. So hopefully Georgia will be the one speaking most of the time. I just want to tell you a little bit about her. She is a two-time Emmy-nominated journalist who was one of two journalists in the courtroom for the Derek Chauvin sentencing. Her reporting has been published on CNN, ABC, NBC, Fox, and CBS affiliates. Since 2019, she has actively produced and published digital content independently to activate her own platform and create opportunities for other creators. And as we talk with you this evening, Georgia, I'm surrounded here by your photos. I get to look at all of this around me. And you are documenting history. And I was so struck by that this isn't history, this is the present, that what you've depicted in these photos happened last week in Minnesota, will probably happen again before we know it. And I want to get into throughout the evening, and I want folks to put questions if they have them, but your work is showing humanity, showing this complexity, that this is not just a police issue. Media has some culpability in this as well, and I want to kind of get into some of that stuff. But first, I want to start with the first photo and just have you kind of explain to us what this one was about, and then we'll kind of move through things. And Katie's going to share that with us.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to just say it is a pleasure to be here with you all, to hold space with you all. I am extremely grateful that Katie allowed me to share my work with your community, and just excited to have this conversation tonight, and to hear the comments and questions that you guys might have about not just my work specifically, but what we're experiencing collectively together in this time and being in the state of Minnesota.
There, that especially Georgia, that the sign there, Minnesota changed nothing, I thought, on this day, in this moment, meant so much. But tell us about this photo.
So this was a photo that was taken right outside of the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis. This was during the several days when folks were waiting for the verdict to be reached. And, you know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. But what I found, especially in covering a lot of protests, there's just something powerful about capturing words on a sign, and Minnesota changed nothing is something that it's a sentiment that I think a lot of people in not just the state but the country have been saying. When you look at the murder of George Floyd, that was a turning point for many people in this country, a breaking point where folks felt like things had to change. There were so many commitments and pledges that were made, so many advisory councils that were formed, legislation that was drafted. But the reality is, the George Floyd Policing Act was not passed on a federal level. So, despite how horrific that incident was, despite the communal response to that tragedy, despite the international response to that tragedy, it still wasn't polarizing enough to to get legislation passed. Right? Not everybody who was a lawmaker was on board with making those changes on a policy level. And so here we are, less than 2 years later, where we are now confronted with the reality of another Black man killed at the hands of police, and obviously in a much different situation in terms of Amir Locke. And in this case, with this photograph, the death of Dante Wright was very, very different. But nonetheless, each one of these situations forces us to ask ourselves a very serious question about equity and whether or not Black Americans are treated with the same dignity and respect as white Americans, specifically when they're encountering police.
I wonder if I can, you're a very busy journalist. What was today like for you? What were you covering?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We are now 8 days past the fatal police shooting of Amir Locke. There has not been charges have not been brought forth against the officer, so that's been an ongoing demand made by community. The Hennepin County attorney has said that he's going to depend on the attorney general to help him in this case, similarly to the cases of Derek Chauvin and Potter. And so today there was a press conference held by national civil rights attorney Ben Crump at the Capitol, alongside the Locke family and other families who have lost a loved one to the police. And there they announced the demand for the Amir Locke law, which would abolish no-knock warrants. So I covered that this afternoon. And then following that, there was a report I did for an outlet summarizing what's happened over the last 8 days. I did a one-on-one interview with Crump and the family right before this call. And they sat down with me. I've had the opportunity to develop a relationship with Attorney Crump over the last 2 years, and I interviewed him also when he was advocating for justice for Kelvin Horton, who was a protester who was killed um, by a business owner, and no charges ended up being brought forth in that case. And so to be able to sit down with them as a local independent journalist, they don't take interviews with everybody, and so it's an honor to be able to hear from them. But the biggest question I had for them was just about the state of the Minneapolis Police Department, because some of the questions that are coming up for me as a journalist, and a journalist who is not, you know, I'm not in contract with any outlet. I'm not an employee of any outlet. And so that allows me to be somewhat of a media critic and to ask some of the tough questions that I probably wouldn't be able to ask if I was somebody's employee. But the question that I've been asking my colleagues who work in journalism, in the field of journalism here locally, is, you know, why do you still consider the Minneapolis Police Department a credible source? Because with the handling or mishandling of Amir Locke's case, we have public documentation, a record of them not being honest with information. Amir Locke was inaccurately identified as a suspect by the Minneapolis Police Department in a press release that was sent out to the media. You know, as a journalist, I'm looking for facts here. I'm not trying to make accusations that I cannot substantiate. And I'm not trying to make things about race when they're not about race. I want to look at the facts. I want to share the accurate information with my audience. And in order to be able to do that, two things need to happen. I need to be able to tell both sides, and I need to be able to trust the sources that are giving me information. And unfortunately, in my experience over the last 2 years, the Minneapolis Police Department has demonstrated a history of sharing bad information. Amir was not a suspect. The warrants were unsealed today. You asked, you know, what I did today. I also followed that. The warrants were unsealed today in that case, and that verified that he wasn't a suspect. And so we were still asking, why was he identified as a suspect by MPD in the first press release? Why were photographs of his gun published by MPD without the context that he was a legal gun owner? And who's going to be responsible for um, these partial narratives that now have criminalized this young man, right? And the last thing I'll say here, because that kind of summarizes what I did today, but the last thing to that point, the Minneapolis Police Department did issue a press release about George Floyd immediately following his death, where they claimed that he died of medical complications. And we know, based on the footage that Darnell Frazier captured, that's not what happened. And based on the determination made by a jury and Judge Cahill, from a legal standpoint, that's not what happened. And so now, as a journalist, you know, we must really ask ourselves, these sources who we depend on for so much information, if they have a history and a track record of not sharing accurate information, you know, we are doing a disservice to the people that, to our audience. We're doing them a disservice by continuing to distribute information from them.
Can you talk a little bit more about how that actually happens for journalists when they get that information? Did you get the information as well about him being a suspect, and how quickly that kind of happens?
Yeah, well, the city of Minneapolis has set up a website for this specific case, the case of Amir Locke. They consider this a critical incident. And so any updates are made to that website. So myself, other members of the media, and anyone else who, you know, they inform that that website exists, would have access to updates about this case. And so, yes, I did get the press release where Amir Locke was called a suspect. I did get the photographs at the same time mainstream media got them. And in honesty, right, the ethics of journalism require us to be unbiased, balanced, and objective. And so a balanced story about Amir would also include a comment from his family. And so, had mainstream media upheld their own values and standards of being balanced and they would have waited until they had a statement from the family in response to this new information, then we would be in a better place collectively, because then there wouldn't be people in this community who, and let's be clear, if you consume news, right? How many people are like avid newspaper readers? How many people pick up the newspaper every single day? Not many, right? You might pick it up on Tuesday, and maybe you might pick it up next Thursday, but there's not a ton of people who read the paper every day. The same thing for the newscast. You might sit down and watch it on Monday, and then maybe you don't get back to it again until Friday. So you might miss developments that happen in specific cases. And so if you consume the news on February 2nd, when he was called a suspect, or if you consumed the news when the photographs of his gun were published, then you were left with the impression that this was a criminal who was dangerous, who was armed, and probably deserved what happened to him. Had the media have waited until they had a statement from the family could have provided them with evidence, and the facts that he was a legal gun carrier, which totally changes the dynamics of this story. And so, in the work that I do, I have committed my work as a journalist to changing the narrative, because these are not new things. These are this is a reoccurring theme that we have seen with racialized terror in America. You can go back historically and you can see ways in which the media was used as a vehicle to either incite violence against Black communities and communities of color, or the way in which the media was used to justify it. And don't just take my word for it. Howard University has done this elaborate research project called Print in Hate. And if you don't take anything else away from this conversation, take that. Get your phone out, get a notepad. Print in Hate. It's a research study that's currently being done by Howard University. And it's just fascinating the way that they've been able to unveil this paper trail, specifically in newspapers, where the newspapers were used to incite white mobs that would lynch Black people. One of the headlines that I usually point to, one of the articles I usually point to, is from Tulsa, Oklahoma, after a Black man was accused of assaulting a white woman in an elevator. The headline from that paper said, "Nab Negro who assaulted girl in elevator." And when you think about the principles of journalism being unbiased, being balanced, being objective, the word NAB, N-A-B, is not objective. It's not unbiased. It's not balanced. It's a call to action. It's telling you to do something, right? And so there are examples of this all throughout history that you can look at, and Print and Hate has compiled that research in one place where it's a lot easier to consume. And then so if we have this evidence now that media has historically been a system that has also produced inequities in our country in its own way, right? How do we reconcile that? Who should be held accountable for that? But most importantly, how do we change that? Because we know that those same systems exist today. And so if those same systems exist, then now we can start to understand how we are at this place where the media in modern day is still functioning as a vehicle to perpetuate harm and violence to communities of color.
Did have a question from Julie. She said, Cahill signed the no-knock warrant for this case. What is that impact?
Well, I think that, we could speculate about whatever connection there is between Cahill signing this no-knock warrant and also being the presiding judge over the Derek Chauvin trial. Um, and so I don't want to speculate what the connection is, but to your question about the impact, um, communities of color are connecting these dots and asking, you know, is this a system I can trust? Is this system of public safety really here to keep me safe? And so when you have a judge who presided over a case that did bring justice for the Black community, and then that's in kind of on one breath, and then in the next breath you're signing a no-knock warrant that leads to the death of another Black man. I think the impact that has, it further erodes the trust in the leadership throughout the city of Minneapolis. And I think that it further erodes the trust in the system, specifically the public safety system.
Can you talk a little bit about why you are an independent journalist? And Georgia, let's say I can give you all the power in the world, and what just happened with how it was reported for Amir Locke. What should media have done if they made that mistake? How should that go?
So to start with why I'm independent, I haven't always been independent. I worked in mainstream media. I started my career in radio and then transitioned into news. I worked in Duluth for a short period of time as a morning anchor and a noon anchor and producer. I worked in Columbus, Georgia as a reporter, as a multimedia journalist on TV, and as a weekend anchor. And I really loved my job. I loved being able to amplify voices of people who otherwise, seemingly didn't have a voice. When my husband and I got married and had she's now 4, our 4-year-old daughter, I did not get maternity leave. And at that time, of course, I was devastated. But the reason why I didn't get maternity leave is the company I was working for said that I had only been employed with them for 11 months. And so in order to be eligible for maternity leave, you have to, under FMLA, work for a company for 12 months. There may have been some other factors that influenced that decision. I don't know. I am a journalist who unapologetically tells Black stories. And I don't know if that played a role in their decision, but what I was told, and even either way, also to be a woman and not get maternity leave doesn't feel very fair in the 21st century. But I was oddly optimistic that I would be able to come back to my hometown. I'm from St. Paul. I graduated from the University of St. Thomas. And so I was oddly optimistic that this would be my opportunity to come back home and work in my hometown market. Unfortunately, I didn't get hired at any of the stations who at the time all had openings. This was, I believe, the beginning of 2018. And so I was faced with a very difficult fork in the road. And how do I continue doing this work without a job? Like, do I pack up and move again to another market with a young family? And so that didn't quite make sense at that time. So I went through a period of discovery and exploration of what does it look like to be a independent journalist? How do you sustain that work from a financial standpoint? It was tough. Honestly, I describe it as the second hardest time in my life. First being losing a child of my own when I was 19. But I worked a few odd jobs, and I just had this strong conviction that I am called to tell stories in my culture. The griot, storytellers, oral history is a big part of our culture, and I felt called to carry that tradition, standing on the shoulders, as it is Black History Month, of Ida B. Wells, who was an investigative reporter that documented lynchings that were happening across America, standing on the shoulders of L. Alex Wilson, who reported on integration and was brutally beat as just a reporter by a white mob during his coverage of the Little Rock Nine, standing on the shoulders of the photojournalist who bravely took pictures of Emmett Till, and so I decided that I don't need anybody's permission to, except for the people of who I'm telling the stories of, right? I don't need the permission of an outlet or a network to go into my community and tell our stories. I realized that I didn't need a network or a platform to be able to do this work. When I started as an independent journalist, I had 13,000 followers. And I reflected back on a time when I first started in news, and my role was multimedia journalist, which is just a fancy word for a reporter with their own camera. So every day I had to go to work, and I had to film, and I had to edit, and I had to script, and I had to set up my live shots. And after my live shots, I had to go back and I had to change my TV script to AP style for the web. And I had to cut the best video of the three newscasts and publish it to the website and share it on social media. And when I got done, yes, I went home, but I didn't stop working because I had to start thinking about what was my next story for the news tomorrow. And so I knew that I had what it took, because I was what they called a one-man band or a one-woman band when I started in news. And so I said, I'm going to do the same thing, but for Facebook. And I suffered with imposter syndrome when people would come up to me. They're like, oh, you're a reporter. What station do you work for? And it's like, Facebook, kind of, but needless to say, the consistency of going out in community and telling stories, and being nimble and being diligent and focusing on being right, not focusing on being first, focusing on going deep and not just trying to get the most sensationalized headline. I've just passed 90,000 followers, and I've created a sustainable model to be able to do this work.
Yeah, and just to be, I'm a supporter of yours. I look at it as I want good journalism out there. It's something I can do. I can support the journalism that I trust, and it's something I can do through Facebook. And if people are interested in this topic and interested in the work Georgia's doing, you should check her out on Facebook. I wanted to get that in there. But yeah, okay, so I gave you the power, Georgia. What happened, with the mainstream media and how they reported on this? How should they have handled it after that grave mistake?
So the way that they should have handled it, I think, is examine their own policies, and take ownership of it. It's not solely the media's fault, though. The reality of it is, they should be able to trust their local police department. They should be able to believe that when they get information from the Minneapolis Police Department, that they're getting the best information that's available to them at that time. And instead, what we've seen is a track record of information that diverts responsibility from MPD. What we've seen is a track record of sometimes misinformation or partial information that ends up being favorable for MPD, not necessarily accurate, but favorable for them. And so a half truth is a whole lie, right? So you talk about what should the media have done when they noticed that. I mean, I think that some of the things they could do is and I put this question out there. Um, at what point, like how many lies does a source have to tell you before you don't consider them credible anymore? And so I think the biggest thing that mainstream media needs to do at this point is a serious examination of the sources that they depend on for information. Because if you're saying according to so and so, but like you have to accept responsibility, like if you're spreading misinformation, that you're a part of the problem. So I think they have to examine their protocols for who they deem credible sources. If a source has lied to you multiple times, what do you do? And if it's a source that you depend on to confirm a lot of information, what are your alternatives? These are fair questions that we should be demanding of the entities who promise that they're going to share information with us and for us, right? So I think that's the biggest thing that mainstream media could do. And then examine their correction policies, because I even you could look at outside of cases of police shootings, or excessive uses of force by police. You could even look at the way COVID has been reported on, right? There has been misinformation about different drugs that people could take that would help keep them safe, or act as a vaccine. There's been so much, we've heard so many crazy things, right? And so how does a media outlet correct information that's been shared? And so, one thing, pointing back to Winston Smith, who was fatally shot by police in June of last year. He was inaccurately identified as a murder suspect in the Star Tribune. And I asked a similar question then, like, okay, so you publish this inaccurate information. People make mistakes, right? Nobody's perfect. The media is not perfect. This is going to happen. It's happened before. It's going to happen again. But what is your correction policy? And there, I think we were able to get to the heart of something that could be changed, that would create more equitable outcomes for people of color. And so what we discovered there through conversations, and I met with Kendall Harkness at Star Tribune, was that their online policy is to put the correction at the bottom of the article, right? Why don't you move it to the top so that it's easier for readers to find? Also, think about the way we consume news. I'm sure that you've shared a news article online on your social media, on Twitter or Facebook. You reshared something, with your followers, right? So then the next day, if there's a new development, there's a new article, there's a new link. Do you ever go back and reread the old article that you shared yesterday and scroll to the bottom of it to see if there's been any corrections or updates? No, nobody consumes news that way. You read the next article, you don't, nobody ever really circles back to the old article. So why can't those corrections then follow that story? So as people are consuming information, why can't media own their mistakes? Why do they have to bury them at the bottom of the page in old articles behind paywalls? That's not serving the audience. And why can't they, even within the body of the new articles, and TV could have done this too, right? TV is serving the same audience as the newspaper. So in this, pointing to this specific example, the TV stations could have also combated that misinformation and said Winston Smith, who was previously inaccurately identified as a murder suspect, et cetera, whatever the update is. But nobody wants to talk about their competitors. Nobody wants to own their mistakes. But there does have to be some accountability, especially if we want to evolve as a society that is not plagued by misinformation.
Katie, can we go to the next photo? We'll get back to your, although this is what your exhibit is about, freedom of the press is all the things we're talking about. But tell us about this one.
This is a photograph of a protest that happened in Maplewood, which is a suburb of St. Paul. And there was a car full of 6 teenagers who were joyriding. They stole a vehicle, and officers engaged in a high-speed pursuit with this vehicle. They, according to different sources, one of the tactics that they used to get the kids to surrender was they put out, I forget what they're called, but on the street to flatten the tires. And the car spun out of control and crashed. And 2 of the teenagers died. And this was at a time, I believe after Lanil Frazier, who was Darnella Frazier's uncle, the woman who captured the video of George Floyd's death. He also was killed in a high-speed pursuit, and the police weren't pursuing him, but they were pursuing someone else, and they crashed into his car and he died. So now that's another one of those cases where, we can't quite say things are connected, but it definitely does impact the community when there's those weird connections, right? And so for this protest specifically with the children, the young boy who you see with the white t-shirt is the baby brother of one of the kids who was killed, 14-year-old Marcos. And then the black boy with the sign is a friend of his. And it's interesting. This was a photograph that has actually not been included in any of the other gallery displays of my exhibit, and has actually been considered probably one of my more controversial photos, where exhibits refuse to actually include this photo because of what the sign says. And the thing about being a journalist is my work is not to say that this is right or this is wrong, but this is a glimpse into a community that has been affected by the policies and the actions and the choices, or should I say, and the inactions in some cases. And so for these kids, that's their reality. That's how they feel. That is what has happened to them. That has been their lived experience. And regardless of where you are on the spectrum of policing, when we look at the policies in this specific case, we have yet to hear from the Ramsey County sheriffs who engaged in this high-speed pursuit on whether or not the sheriff who was pursuing the vehicle was actually following policy. Because in many cities, in many counties, there are policies to not do high-speed pursuits unless it's someone's in imminent danger. And when you're talking about the act of stealing a vehicle, these officers had surveillance on this vehicle when these students drove the car to school, and they could have recovered the stolen property while these kids were in school and given them whatever ticket or jail time that they would have gotten for stolen a vehicle, but they would have lived to see another day. And so, I believe most people understand that policing is a dangerous job and you have to make split-second decisions. But when you talk about being Black in America, in a state where there is no death penalty, then why, in cases where people are engaged or accused of engaging in criminal activity, are they not afforded the opportunity of due process, of going through the criminal justice system, being arrested, going before, having their day in court before a judge or a jury, and then serving time, right? Like that is the way that we have said as a society that these behaviors should be dealt with. But in this case, we saw that a sheriff decided to value property and pursue this vehicle or teach these kids a lesson. I don't know. But the question I have as a journalist was the officer following the policy? And it's unfortunate that myself, along with other even mainstream media, have not been able to get them to go on the record about what their high-speed pursuit policy is. And so the lack of transparency should be concerning to everybody who lives in Ramsey County.
If anybody has questions on the photos we're showing here or anything, thanks for everybody who's putting some comments in the chat. Katie, let's move to the next one. I think some of the kids ones are what really struck me, Georgia, in the work that I'm getting to sit in tonight. Tell us about this photo.
Can I pose a question to you?
Yeah.
What was it about this photo that caught your attention and made you want to have a conversation surrounding this photograph?
The boys, the looks on the boys' faces as they talk to this man. They're obviously shorter, but they're in sort of awe and they're trying to tell him something. And I want to know what this conversation is. There's something about it and then standing outside the police department, the dog in the frame. It's not a great answer, but it was, I think, sort of an emotional reaction to it.
Yeah. So this photograph was taken the same day. You might recognize the boy. He has a different sign now, right?
Yeah.
And so the reason why I wanted to include this photograph was because there's an intergenerational component here. There is race represented in this photograph with the police station as the backdrop. You can't quite tell if this white man is a police officer because, I don't know, is that a canine? So there's a lot of questions to be answered here. And so I felt like this was a photograph that showed that these conversations, like these three young Black boys are trying to communicate their lived experience to this older white man. And that is their grief of losing someone at the hands of police, right? But even still, their joy, they're trying to convey their innocence as boys. And too often, I think, young Black men are misportrayed as men, and so this photograph there's not a huge story behind this photograph, except for that these conversations are happening in community. We see the protests, right? This was moments after the other picture was taken, right? And so these intergenerational conversations, interfaith conversations are happening in community. We see the protesting, some people, they see the looting and these other things, but they don't see this part. And I think that it's this part of the coming together where true change is going to happen, where we can set aside our political differences, set aside our age, set aside our race, and engage with each other as human beings, and so I don't know if that's what other people see when they see this photograph, but there's just something for me about this photo that really captured the humanity of three Black boys and a white man who was using his body as an ally, you know. And this photograph inspires me, right, to continue having these conversations, because it's going to take all of us working together to create a more equitable society.
And let's move to the last one that I had chosen to talk about. There's a whole other part of your exhibit with freedom of the press. Tell us about this.
This is the White House, believe it or not. This is Washington, D.C. I traveled to D.C. With the intent of covering the inauguration. And days before I was scheduled to get on my flight, January 6th happened, which totally changed the climate in DC leading up to the inauguration. And so when I arrived in DC, the hotel I was staying at was actually just a couple of blocks away from the nation's capital. And I had to go through a military clearance in order to check into my hotel, because that's how much military had been deployed there. There was a 3 mile radius of security checkpoints. So anywhere within a 3 mile radius of the National Mall, any of the national monuments, the White House, the Capitol, 3 mile radius surrounding them, there was a perimeter that had been created by the military. And so I somehow I've walked and walked and walked and finally made it as close as I could get to the White House. And as many of you know, the one of the streets leading to the White House is now Black Lives Matter Plaza. And so that's actually part of the reason why this photo is tinted yellow, because of the big yellow words on the streets. Um, but all of these signs, one of the banners in the background, you can see it says impeach. Um, I can't remember the other words on that sign, but you know, there were demands for Trump to be impeached at that point. And it just, you know, I had been to DC before, but never actually to the White House. And this is just not the sight you expect to see when you roll up to the White House. And so I felt like it was important to document that this was Trump's last night at the White House. This is what it looked like at the end of his presidency. This is the message that some Americans wanted to leave for him. If you look as well, you can see there's a fence, and behind the fence, you'll notice there's actually another street behind that fence. And so if you cross the street, you'll see that there's a whole nother layer of signs. So not just the flags and the banner that you see kind of like in that first row, but like even further, there was, I mean, so many hundreds of people went down there. And it just, to me, is a historic moment, very significant, not just because of the you know, security, the National Guard, the military that had been deployed there, but this response from Americans.
So I was just curious about what the title means to you, freedom of the press.
Well, what's not documented in these photographs is my own lived experience as a journalist who has been out here covering historic moments, covering challenging stories, and the exploration that I've had to have on like what freedom do I have really as an independent journalist, right? Like I've been shot by the police covering protests. I was shot with a rubber bullet during the Dante Wright protests. Um, trying to explain that to my three daughters when I come home. I've been tear gassed, maced. Um, I was covering a story about community violence in North Minneapolis, and just as I was wrapping up an interview with a grandfather whose 6-year-old daughter was fatally shot in the head, drive-by happened right in front of us. I have friends, colleagues who have been arrested despite having a press pass. We saw what happened to Omar, who was a reporter for CNN covering the protests after George Floyd's murder, and he was arrested live on CNN, right? There was a woman who was reporting after George Floyd who had her eye shot, who was shot in her eye and lost one of her eyes. I have colleagues whose equipment was broken. There was just a lawsuit that was settled. The ACLU sued a number of the law enforcement agencies for their treatment of the media. And so freedom of the press, while the title itself doesn't necessarily reflect the stories that I've covered and the stories that are documented in the exhibit, it encompasses the struggle, right, that I've had even internally while I've covered my community fighting for their own liberation. I have also had to ask myself, as a Black journalist, an independent journalist that's outside of the mainstream media system, like, what freedom do I have? Does the First Amendment, the right to free press, apply to me? And so I felt like I while covering these stories over the last 2 years, there's also been a serious story that has unfolded within, the freedom of the press, and it's something that we should ask ourselves. I know I tend to show up as a critic of media, but media is a very powerful tool when used correctly. And I do believe that our democracy depends on our ability to document, to investigate in a way that does hold people accountable.
Okay, well, if anyone has any questions, we heard how busy George has been today, so I don't want to keep her longer than she's promised us. But if anybody has any questions, if you want to type them or if you want to just unmute yourself, we have a few minutes left. I do want to remind you too, you can go to georgiafort.com, and I think, Georgia, you can buy the photos as well.
Yep, the photographs are now available online at georgiafort.com. There's also a photo book. So if you would like a book of all of the photo, not all of them, but most of them, that is also available as a keepsake. And then outside of that, there is the opportunity to be a monthly supporter. Heidi, I think that was something you said. And I saw that in the chat. Someone asked, how can one support independent journalists? Most independent journalists are supported by community. And so whether that's a one-time contribution, becoming a monthly supporter, purchasing photographs or books, or simply following and sharing our work, for me, that I think has been the way I have felt the most supported, to be on this journey as an independent journalist 2 years in and have grown from 13,000 followers to 90,000 followers. I can't express my gratitude to the community here in the state of Minnesota that has supported my journalism. And to compare that even with local journalists, local anchors, and say, wow, like, outside of the system of mainstream media, outside of these huge platforms, I have been able to cultivate an audience that really wants to find the truth. So I would say, if you're interested in supporting independent journalism, It doesn't have to cost you a dime. It could just be simply following, engaging with our work, leaving a comment, what you think, questions you have, or simply sharing it.
Any questions from anyone? Oh, there we go. There we all are. And I also, Georgia, we really appreciated at KEXE and KBXE, we were able to run, we heard you on Racial Reckoning and also on the podcast Bearing Witness. And before we started the formal Zoom here, the exhibit is going other places. So if anyone here has connections to places it could be, they can probably find that out on your website as well.
Yep. So it will be at Carleton College next, coming up in May. There may be one more stop in between, working to confirm that now, but we do have Carleton College confirmed next for May. And I do keep that updated on my website as well.
Okay. Katie, any last thoughts or other questions?
No, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us again, and especially to thank Georgia for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to spend some time with us and to continue the conversation in our communities up here in northern Minnesota. So I really
Oh,
appreciate that.
absolutely. I am so grateful that you created space for my work to be shared publicly. I know these are not the easiest conversations to have, the most comfortable conversations to have, right? And that we nobody will ever see all the way eye to eye on some of these things, but we have to have these conversations in order to move the needle forward, especially in our state. We have some of the worst disparities here in education, in healthcare, in home ownership. And so we do have a collective responsibility to move the needle forward on equity. And I believe that while, yes, having these conversations isn't direct action, it's not doing anything, it informs us and it equips us with what we need to be able to go into community and take action on these things. And so I truly hope that I've said something to inspire you all, to get in your community and to do something about it, to be a part of the change, because it's going to take all of us working together, to make specifically our state, our home, a more equitable place.
All right, we'll get to you. There's some great comments from folks on there, Georgia. And thanks again. And thanks to everybody for joining us tonight.
Yep, thanks. And you can still catch the exhibit up at McCroskey Arts Center through February 16th. And shout out to the City of Grand Rapids Human Rights Commission for supporting this as well. Got to give
Take
them some props.
selfies and send me your selfies if you go. I'd love to see you in the space, and I'd love to know what your favorite photo is. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.